All right, let's draw our Monstera leaf. The first thing we're going to do is plan out the placement and the shape of our leaf. Monstera leaf is generally heart-shaped, and if you see here, when I'm drawing a shape, I oftentimes draw kind of multiple lines and then erase and pick my favorite. So I'm making a long, pretty big heart shape, but I also want to be careful of the edges of the paper. When you're drawing a picture, you want to keep some space between your subject matter and the edges. And since we're not really making a background, the only thing in our painting is the leaf. So I want to give a little bit of breathing room to my leaf. So I want to make sure it's not super close to the edges of the paper. Now that we have the basic heart shape of our leaf, we're going to be adding all the individual, I guess they're not really individual leaves, but parts of the leaf. What I'm going to be doing is kind of tracing the curve, and I'm going to be avoiding touching the center of my leaf. For this painting, we're going to be leaving some white space as an outline. So each of these shapes is not going to completely connect to its neighbor. So look how I left kind of a empty little gap between those two parts. Also, if you've seen Monstera leaves, they are really cool because they leave those openings so that the leaves below them have sunlight coming through. So we're going to be creating some large, almost cuts or gashes and holes and circles inside of our leaves so that the light can pass through. Your openings and edges do not have to look exactly like mine. Just kind of have fun creating variety. So different sizes of openings, different lengths, but you're still following that curve of the heart that you made, keeping those little, almost like rivers in between each part of the leaf. As I get to the bottom of this half, I'm going to try to curve this shape down a little bit, and then I'll just create a simple little triangle at the end, and I won't worry about any openings or things. Now, I want to do the same type of thing on the other side. I don't want it to be symmetrical. This is nature. It does kind of random weird things. So I just want to keep that idea of gashes and openings and interesting things happening on each side, but making them a little bit different. You might even notice that I'm purposefully wiggling some of my lines, especially at the edge of the leaf, so that it looks more natural and not perfect. Perfect doesn't really exist in nature, so it's good to have those wiggly or random shaped lines. I'm also, now that I'm adding this second side, keeping that river gap between the two halves of my heart-shaped leaf. This just will create an interesting look when we're painting to have this white space in between each of the leaves. I'm going to go ahead and keep creating these different shapes and parts, and you can follow along, or you can make some of your own decisions about where those gaps, holes, or cracks are. Now that I have those individual shapes, I'm going to go back and try to do a little bit of erasing of the lines I don't want. Any pencil lines that stay underneath the paint will likely be visible unless it's a very dark area of paint. So I want to get rid of as many that I don't need as possible. But it's also going to just act as an edge. So it's okay if some of the pencil left behind, because then that creates a darker edge to the paint. Now, I drew kind of darker than I usually do so that you could see my drawing. However, when I paint it, I don't want these quite so dark. So after I've really erased the lines I don't want at all, I'm going to carefully erase everything. So I'm very lightly dragging my eraser over the entire drawing because I want it to get a lot lighter so it's less obvious when I paint on top of it. So try to erase most of your drawing without, of course, erasing everything, because you need to see where those edges are while you're painting. Okay, now when we are painting our leaf, we're really only using green. However, we want to create an interesting green. So I'm going to be mixing multiple greens and adding some blues to my green to make it the most interesting that I can. So I'm trying to create kind of a cooler green, cooling it down by adding some blues to it. But also, I like to not mix it perfectly, so keeping a few different greens available is nice because then my leaf will have more variation and interest to it. If you have an exact green that you want to use, that's great too, because you'll probably have to mix up more paint every time you run out if you're doing it like me, and then it might not match completely, and that's okay too, but it can be easier if you mix up a lot first, or you do find an exact green that you enjoy using. Now, I always add a little bit of brown to my green because I want it to appear more muted or toned down, not super vibrant. It just feels a lot more like real nature. So I've mixed in just a tiny bit of brown so it's not quite as bright. Now you'll see I'm using a fairly small brush because we have lots of little tiny spaces to paint in today. Our goal is to keep our brush very wet and to fill in each shape that we painted, being very careful to stay inside the lines. So I don't want each of these sections to touch. I want them to stay separate. So I'm following the edge of my pencil line and I'm being careful not to cross over those rivers. But I'm also trying to keep it very wet. So you'll see I'm kind of working along the edge. I'm not tracing the whole outside of the shape first and going back because watercolor can start to dry and that'll create a hard edge where we do not want it. So I want to paint a whole area while it is all wet. Then I can go back and add little bits of layers while it's wet, and you'll see it kind of spreads and moves around and very gradually fills in that space. So thinking about where you want some shadows or darker edges, how you want it to blend and go together, kind of fill in those edges while it's still wet because then it will automatically smoothly stay together. Here I'm adding just tiny bits of brown to those edges. That was too much, so I wiped it off and got some more green to kind of let it bleed and run around. Now it's okay to jump around a little bit while it's still wet. So you see I tried to use up some of my extra paint on my next space and then go back and move that brown around. But I can't forget that next space I started because if I leave it there, it can start to dry. So the main thing with watercolor paint, especially with this painting, is you want to be working in the same area and work on it while it's wet. Don't do half of the shape and walk away. You can walk away after one shape, but make sure when you start a shape, you kind of finish it or you fill it all with solid color so that you don't have any hard edges inside of each shape. You want the hard edges on the side of the shape. Hopefully, as you're painting, you are realizing that the more water you add, the lighter your paint color gets. The more pigment you have, the darker it gets. That is a very important thing to be paying attention to as you create your variations in value in the darkness and lightness of your leaf. So thinking about where do I want to keep the edges dark, I would say the edges are where you want to keep a darker value and keep it kind of lighter in this middle or where the leaf might be curved and be reflecting some of the light. Now, the nice thing about this painting is it is a fairly repetitive process. You are doing the same thing to each section of your leaf, paying attention to darks, lights, and filling it all in while it's wet. So I'm going to go ahead and put on a little bit of music, but I'm not going to speed up the video at all so that you can see in real time where I'm painting and how I'm painting. And then you can always pause and rewind as you need to see different spots. I will come back with a few more tips and tricks as we get further along. Okay, you might notice kind of my mistake in this area where I made that one section very dark. So what I've been doing for the last little bit is I've been trying to pull some of the color off. By drying my brush and kind of pulling it across the wet paper, I can pull off some of that color. And here, since the paper is still wet, I can actually pull off some of the color by using a tissue. So as long as your paper is wet, you can kind of soak up that paint and pull and stamp it off of your paper. And you can still do this even after it dries as long as you get it fully wet again and let it sit for a second so that that water wakes up the paint. That's a great way to lighten an area that got too dark. But of course, it's always ideal if you work from lightest to darkest, and unlike me, don't jump in and make that area really dark right away. Now that I lightened it, I went back and added some of those edge shadows. Same with this leaf down here, making sure that even around those holes that I have a little bit of shadow or an edge. Oftentimes there's a little bit of a color difference around where those holes are formed, kind of like the edges of leaves as they are changing for fall. They might get a little bit browner or more muted or just darker. So adding those little details can really help. At this point, hopefully you've seen a lot of different techniques as I've been moving in real time. Just for the sake of our own sanity and length of this video, I am going to jump forward these last few little sections, and then I'll give some more instructions at the end. All right, now we could be done, but after my paint dried, I realized that it dried lighter than what I thought it would. And that happens a lot with watercolor. You kind of have to paint knowing it will dry a little lighter than you expect. So I feel like I am missing some of those shadows I really wanted to add. So I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna add some darker edges, but since it's all dry, I have to do this a little bit differently. I'm gonna start by adding some dark, but then I'm going to dry my brush and I'm going to spread that dark on top of the whole area. So with a dry brush, I go back on top and I just kind of move the paint over a little bit, leaving the darkest areas right at the edge. This takes a little bit of practice. Make sure you're not using a lot of paint and not using a lot of water when you first create it. It's very small amount of paint, small amount of water, and then wiping your brush off on a towel. If you need to wash it and then dry it, that can work too. But with it's mostly dry, that's when you kind of go back on top and just kind of smooth and spread that value, the shadow around, so that you can still have the dark edge without a hard edge. So if you have the same problem as me where it dried a little lighter, you can go back and add more shadows with this technique. And if you know me, I really usually add pen to my watercolor paintings, but this is one I did not. I really like the simplicity of the watercolor on its own, but it could benefit from some fun dark lines, kind of outlining it, or just even kind of loosely outlining. Up to you. I hope you enjoyed painting this Monstera leaf with me today. I've been really excited to do it. If you paint one, I'd love to see it and hear about it. You can find me on Instagram at Alyssa Whetstone Art. Follow my channel here on YouTube to see other tutorials as well. See you later.